Okay, we start now.
Yep, so we're doing the Mentee presentations. So first up, we've got Max. Um, he's doing a book overview for us. So Max, take it away.
Okay, so this will be an overview, like maybe a summary of the mental game of poker by Jared Tendler. This is his first book of a series of two. I guess let's start now. So this is what's going to be talked about during the presentation. So first, the small short introduction that we're doing. Then uh, we'll talk about a few things that mental game fishes think or do. Then we'll talk about a few myths about mental game, the central concepts to mental game, and the main emotions involved. Then a couple of strategies in solving the mental game issues. And we'll talk about like these four center subjects of the mental game: tilt, fear, confidence, motivation. Then we'll have a short conclusion. Okay, so the players that have a successful mental game, so they share a few points in common. They have structure and methodology. They don't rely on luck, um, meaning that their A game and tilting, it's not random. So they know that it happens for predictable reasons instead, and they study their own patterns. That is, they do uh, work off the table on their mental game. So this is a few things that you could hear, or maybe things players think in their head. They think, I know variance happens, so it's stupid to tilt from a bad beat, or for some reason I played like a donkey last night. Again, this is highlighting that some players, they don't see that they have actions take to change what happens with their mental game. Um, so this is sort of taking the responsibility out of their mental game. Also, I wish I could play as well as today all the time, or always play my best on party poker. So that's a wish that we're gonna see a few other wishes later near the end. But we can see that some wishes can be detrimental. Here again, it's as if the player is thinking that he cannot do something towards his mental game, but as we'll see, there are quite a few things that we can do to help ourselves. Um, so the mental game fish, they do a couple things. Maybe not all of those, but these are common things that they will do. They will change a proven strategy when they're running hot or cold. So if they're winning a lot lately, maybe they're gonna change the way they play, uh, or maybe they're gonna do that if they're running cold also, play more hands or less hands, change their opening ranges, for example. They don't recognize when other players outplay them. So it's always about luck. They're unlucky or people are lucky, and they don't try to search for the reasons of people taking certain lines sometimes. They try to win every hand. They get frustrated when bad players win against them, and they feel like failure when they lose a hand that was played profitably. Say common coolers like kings against aces. The mental game fish, they also read poker books too fast, believe in curse, they believe in owning souls. So this was a thing that came uh, a couple times in the book that came up, believing in owning souls. I'm not sure what that means exactly, but and then they get bored playing at lower stakes. So if they have to do some bankroll management, maybe they're gonna be less concentrated when they have to drop down stakes, for example. Allow things to get personal with other regs. You're gonna hear them say one time, or they'll be telling bad beat stories to anybody that will listen. So now we've seen a couple of myths and what the fish, like the mental game fish, do. Now there are like common strategies dealing with, uh, I guess, common mental game problems. So phrases like "just stay calm," "don't let it tilt you." So we're gonna see later that there's a strategy, like the first strategy for short-term dealing with the mental game problem or issues is going to be called injecting logic, and maybe that's like sort of the common uh, logic injection, if you will. So just stay calm, don't let it tilt you, don't focus on the money, make the right decision, take a deep breath, be fearless, and all those just amount to saying just win the hand. It doesn't give you a way to do things. Um, like there's no plan here really. So a couple more myths. Uh, that the emotions are a problem and they need to be blocked at all times. So the emotions are instead um, symptoms of mental game issues that we have, and they're gonna show us the way to deal with our problems. So they're not the problem itself. Other common misconception that we either have mental game talent or we don't. So some players have like a natural talent, but it doesn't mean that because you have a natural talent for mental game that you cannot change like the level of your mental game. Also, changing a habit is as simple as saying don't do it. It's more it's more work than that. Usually it includes establishing routines, and we'll see like the later the process model that's going to help us with that. Also, another myth: you should always quit if you think you're about to tilt. So the keyword here is always. Sometimes maybe it's good strategy to quit when you're about to tilt, or if you're starting to. But as we're going to see, it's hard to see when you're about to tilt. And if you always quit before you're about to tilt, maybe you're never going to sort of push yourself and see that maybe you can last a couple more hands, maybe a half an hour more at the table without tilting. So sort of trying to build that mental stamina, I guess. This wasn't so clear in the book, though. Again, a myth. You can win by visualizing yourself winning, and the key to surviving downswings is to take breaks or change stakes. A bit like what we saw in the mental game Fish, what they do. Maybe I think there's a link here. Playing your A game is random. It's not, and the mental game is deep, complicated, and mysterious. So going a couple times through the book for the purposes of doing this review, I can say that it's not that deep, complicated, and mysterious. Um, so the four essential areas are fear, tilt, confidence, and motivation. And the issues in mental game are intertwined. So maybe an issue with confidence and fear, like issues in both could be linked, like one causing the other, like fear causing a failure in confidence, or maybe one's um, one's probability of tilting, like if he's prone to tilting, maybe his motivation uh, will be impacted by that. Mental game problems are caused by errors in the way players view learning and performance. So it's born of a conflict between what you consciously hold as true and unconscious expectations that you have, and this conflict is going to generate the emotions and the tilting that goes with it sometimes. Players will fight against their biased views of learning and performance. When the expectations are honest, they will work within the reality of what is true. So that's saying the same thing again with different words. Um, so it's really about the expectations of what how much you're gonna learn, how well you're gonna perform, and acknowledging or being honest with what variance has in its effect uh, on one's game. So the three important concepts in this book are the adult learning model. So this is describing the way that we learn. It goes through 4 steps, as we'll see. Then the edgeworm concept, again describing how we learn, and the process model. That's sort of the way that we're gonna schedule or arrange our work on our game, the warm ups, when we play the cooldowns, and the off table work. That's part of the process model. So the adult learning model, the 4 steps here. First, the unconscious incompetence. So that's the stuff we don't know that we don't know. So obviously, I can't give you an example of that. Second, the conscious incompetence. For example, I know that I don't know certain preflop charts. So then I will have to look at them. Looking at them and uh, producing the correct behavior, for example, raising or folding certain hands in certain spots. That's going to be part of the conscious competence part. And then the unconscious competence part is something that you don't have to think about. You're going to do the right thing, right? Or also maybe like some learned mistakes or like bad habits are going to fall into that category. The unconscious competence, for example, folding 7 deuce under the gun. You don't have to think much about that, so it falls in that category.
Hey, Max.
Next, yeah,
Yeah, just a question about that. In the conscience competence, I mean that obviously also comes from having worked your way through one, two, and three, right, and getting to a point where you're competent such that it becomes repetitive without you really having to think about it. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, of course, there's going to be work. First, finding what you don't know. So I guess we do a lot of that. For example, in the Zenith chats, we're gonna look at things, see things that people post, and notice things that we weren't aware of. And then once you know that you don't know these things, then the active learning process steps in, I guess. And conscious competence is, for example, um, if it's something that you're gonna have to think about to do it. If you're not actively thinking about it, you're not gonna do it, or at least it's gonna be random, right?
Hmm.
So at the point of conscious competent, it's about you can do it, but you just have to do it so many times that you can sort of print that in your brain, and then it becomes unconscious,
Right.
like driving your car, right?
Hmm.
And then the unconscious part, of course. when it's mastered and don't have to think about it anymore. So I guess that's where
Yeah.
we also try to go. Okay, then the inchworm concept, the second concept. Um, so we see the inchworm here on the left. What happens is the inchworm has legs at its front end and legs at its back end, but none in the middle. So it's gonna walk weird like that. What happens with the inchworm is that once the front end advances, then it locks its legs there, and then the back end can also advance or walk. And learning is so this is an analogy to learning, I guess. We can here say that by learning a new concept or idea, the front end of our learning inchworm advances. Correcting flaws in technical game allows for the back end to advance. So he sorts of regroup here, allowing further concepts to be learned. So the front end advancing again. And progress is harder to achieve if only the front end advances. So if the inchworm is all flat on its branch here, it's going to be very hard for him to make progress if he doesn't unlock and move the back legs forward. And the same is true for our game. If we have a C game here, that's our C game, the B game, the most common of our game, and the A game, that's when we play our best, like when we're in the zone. If we don't fix our mistakes and keep improving, then the range of our game gets wider. So the A game may be on the right here, to the far right, and then the B game becomes less and less common as a portion of all of our game. So it's going to be kind of random or unpredictable to know what's going to happen when we go play if we don't fix the mistakes. So implications of the inchworm concept is progress happens from two sides, so improving our best, but also improving our worst. Playing the best is a moving target. And then eliminating C game mistakes and mental game mistakes creates more potential. So yeah, when the inchworm regroups, it allows for the front end to move further. Then we have mistakes in learning. So first, learning new things while avoiding, ignoring, or protecting weaknesses. So that's a mistake. So that's ignoring the C game. What's going to happen? The bell curve will get flatter and flatter. It will create a wide range in our game. Playing the A game is going to take much more energy, as we're going to have to think through a lot of things, including dismissing mistakes in our head. Basic mistakes appear out of nowhere, so there's going to be a very wide range in our game. If we don't fix the mistakes, of course, they're going to show up at one point, even though we can be pinpoint on some other things. It could feel like we've plateaued because it's much harder to make progress. And you have a lot to think during a hand. Yeah, so dismissing the mistakes in our head because they're not unconscious competence yet. So comparing our worst to our best is the second mistakes, the second of two mistakes. It can make us feel worse. Maybe we should instead compare our previous worst to this current worst and see if there's progress made. So let's say this guy, he was spewing like 25 tilts, 25 buy-ins going on insane tilt. Maybe if he only spews 5, then that's progress. Also in the book, um, uh, this pointers to show that in the book, like the audience, like like he wrote the book for all kinds of tilt, like what he calls insane monkey tilt, or just like widening your opening range a bit. So it's like these two extremes. So some examples sometimes may sound extreme, but the book is sort of general in that aspect. So getting back to this, comparing to your previous worst can be a source of motivation. Yeah, so if there's progress between like the two lows. So the third central concept is the process model. So it's very basic, but it's so important, I think. So first, the first step of the process model is preparing. So doing a warm up before playing, performing, that is playing poker. Then so results is not really a step. We don't do anything here, but once we have those results, we have something to work with. For example, hand histories. Then we can, right after we're done playing, evaluate how we played. We're gonna try to estimate, for example, how much variance had an effect on our session. Of course, if we're gonna play a few thousand hands, it's gonna have a pretty big impact. But just just thinking about it, that it has this impact, um, I think it's very valuable. The act of um, estimating variances effect during the evaluation part of the process model, and then the analyzing part. This is the off-table work, and you're gonna take a break between these two. The evaluation part, where you sort of settle down, like let the dust settle down, and the part where you go back into your game, maybe looking for technical mistakes or mental game mistakes, creating strategies, and implementing new things that you're gonna pull in you're gonna put in your next warm up. So that's it's a feedback loop when the process model is performed correctly. Um, so the warm up, of course, remove distractions, that is TV, Facebook, to review session goals. So maybe you can put a small goal for your session. For example, stick to my opening ranges, or try to do X in X spot. Like look for, if you don't four bet enough with this hand or three bet enough with that hand, maybe it could be a session goal if you can hit the spot. Third, review corrections for common technical game mistakes and mental game improvements. And four, take a few deep breaths. And there are optional steps that one can take in the warm up. I think some of them are very very valuable. Decide how long you will play. This one helped me. Instead of trying to get back to even, or keeping the thing going because you're up, but then maybe maybe you're on sort of a little high there, and I don't know, like maybe the excitement could have you change your opening ranges, for example. I don't know. Write down life issues before you play, so so that you can have like a clear mind dedicated to poker when you play. I don't do that, but maybe if you have like an appointment, like just write it down, and then you don't have to think about it anymore. Three, review pertinent hand history. Maybe if you have something that you want to work on your game, you can review a hand history for that before. Watch a Zenith video, of course, that's always good. Meditating, was mentioned in the Zenith chats. Meditating, maybe the member was going through this book when he mentioned that. Plan a reduced number of tables to begin your session. This one, sometimes I do it. Lately, I'm trying to focus on certain parts of my opening range, and that helps me. Maybe opening a couple less tables, then listen to a song to fire you up. Uh, um, yeah, of course, some people will be reactive to that. Performance, it is the part where we play. It will be of lesser quality if we do not warm up properly. I think this is very true. And evaluating should be done after playing. For example, sometimes people will, like, the loser win a hand and then they go through the hand history in poker tracker or hold'em manager. But this is multitasking. It should really be done after we're done playing. Like, unless we're gonna get some crucial info on villain that we can use to exploit him during the game. But like, other than looking at the holdings, like, let's not go too deep into a hand, like calculating MDF and all that. Then the results. So we should not just focus on money. We should um, instead maybe look how well we played. Did we, like, perform the correct actions when we think about results? Uh, Part of it is our level of focus, our degree of tilt control. That's part of our results. And then our improvement of technical and mental game weaknesses. So then the evaluation, it takes place immediately after playing. We're gonna look at tough decision, uh, not necessarily the biggest pots, but maybe hands that we didn't know if we should open or not. So for uh, cold four bets were mentioned lately in the chats, maybe something like that. Estimate how much variance had an effect. I think this is very important, so that you don't accumulate emotions, as we'll see if you don't estimate how much variance had an effect. Maybe you think you played badly, and that's gonna induce some mistake tilt, or then we can review areas that we're trying to improve. Did we produce the behaviors that we wanted to produce during our performance step? And then review session goals. Did we achieve the goals that we set? Did we, for example, for bet a few holdings that we were afraid to, or something of that nature? Maybe write down some notes on hands that you will analyze. So mark hands that you will analyze, and before analyzing, of course, take a break. Um, uh, and then the analyzing part, where you look at marked hands more closely. Could ask questions on the Zenith chats, for example. Watch a few fill out mute videos, very helpful. Doing equity calculations. Take what you've learned during your analysis and adjust your next warm accordingly. Um, then let's go through emotions quickly. So they're not part of the problem, as we said, they're the symptoms of mental game flaws. And common strategies to deal with emotions include becoming robotic, tricking your mind uh, to believing certain things, or becoming desensitized to emotions. And they're generated when flaws in your mental game are triggered during play, or can be accumulated, as we said, when you evaluate your session. A part of that accumulated emotions can be diffused. And I think um, it's so the evaluation part here comes in play with the emotions. So examples of emotions being generated. So a bad beat doesn't cause tilt, so not by itself. So it depends if you have misconceptions and maybe wrong um, perceptions of the game, what it is. Some players do not tilt even after several bad beats. So that shows that it's not the bad beat that causes tilt. It's instead caused by entitlement. So if a player is entitled and loses to a bad player, he will predictably become angry. So that's one example here of emotions generating a certain tilt, and this tilt, it has a kind or uh, a category. We'll see that there are 7 types of it. So resolution is the goal when dealing with mental game issues. It frees mental space to be allocated to learning, because you don't have to fight your mental game issues. So once they're settled, you can concentrate on learning again. Achieving resolution means negative emotions aren't generated anymore. So that's what you strive for. This is the long-term goal of mental game. Um, a malfunctioning mind. So the mind, it works in sequence if we want to think about the mental game. So you have the basic functions of your mind, so breathing, uh, then the emotions, and then thinking, like higher thinking, where you get organized, make plans and all that. If the emotional system is overactive, it shuts down higher brain functions. And symptoms of that are going to be that your mind will go blank, you will overweigh the importance of some info during playing hands, you will miss key pieces of a hand, you could fall back to old habits when the emotions surge. That's going to happen. And also, you could miss key pieces of the conscious competence part of the adult learning model. So things that you're going to have to consciously think about to do correctly at the table, these things, they're going to start like missing from your game as the emotions surge. And so when you can tell that you're having emotions at the table, maybe you should try to control these emotions before they reach a threshold. And the conventional wisdom suggests that it's easy to know when you're on tilt, but it is not, because the part of your brain that's necessary for detecting or correctly judging that you're going on tilt will be shut down by the emotions themselves. So it's like a catch-22 here. And accumulated emotions, like normally they vanish between sessions, but they can accumulate. If they accumulate, then that's sort of a spiral here. That's bad. Accumulating emotions reach tilting threshold faster. We're going to call that emotional baggage here. For example, a player tilts after losing a coin flip, but then he has accumulated emotions. And so he doesn't just react to this coin flip, but also all the previous ones where he did accumulate some anger in his head, maybe. And dealing with accumulated emotions is the toughest part of mental game. You have to like install some processes for diffusing this stacking of emotion. I think the warm up and evaluation part in the process model help a lot with that. If you can implement a few simple strategies here.
Hey, Max.
And yeah,
Yeah, so just a question here or a comment. I would think that in order to diffuse accumulated emotions, maybe one way to do this is spending a bit more time off the table. Like, for example, if you know your baggage is starting to increase to a point where it's impacting your ability to perform, then maybe playing a bit less and learning a bit more, can diffuse, take away some of that baggage. So it's more a thing of just spending more time learning as opposed to playing.
Yeah, changing that ratio, yeah, it looks like an obvious one, or like a plausible one, I would say. Usually we don't want to change the volume so much. Like if we start changing the value too much, maybe that's bad, especially for somebody who relies on poker for a living, for example, I guess.
Hmm.
Um, and also it like it's dangerous, maybe a bit dangerous in the way that um, we can sort of make us believe that by changing volume, maybe we can change our luck, you know, like maybe it could bring some of that too. Um, so, so I think the like the author, like maybe it's a bit harder to know what the author really thinks about that, because I feel like he's being cautious on changing volume, you know, trying not to feed some misconceptions that we're trying to correct to begin with. But he did mention also that sometimes you don't have a choice and you have to like stop playing. So effectively uh, managing our volume.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah, and of course when we learn, spend more time learning, but also spend more time maybe dealing with this mental game issue that we have and finding some solutions that could work for ourselves. I guess both go in pair. Um, so next, strategy for solving mental game issues. So there are two main strategies. The first one is injecting logic. So that's a short-term solution. That's what you're gonna employ when you're at the table. You're sort of gonna remind yourself of some strategic phrases, like strategic logic phrases that can sort of replace your expectations where they should be, maybe. Um, and the second one is aiming for resolution. And so, as we can see, long term, this is achieved through work off the table. That's sort of like having a general strategy for your own mental game, adding steps for your warm up, for example, things that you're going to remind yourself in the warm up, things that you're going to do in the evaluation part, maybe choosing the appropriate phrases that you're going to remind yourself when you can see that this common tilt of yours happens. So a few examples of injecting logic. Um, so you could tell yourself that bad players need to win too, and this is just variance. So again, um, recognizing variance when it happens, that's important. Also, today I have to weather variance and lose the least amount. So let's say you're going through a particular bad stretch, maybe a phrase like that could help you. Um, it feels like I can take on anyone, but I can't. Thinking that way is an illusion. Maybe somebody who's maybe a bit overconfident at one point, and can he can recognize that, and so he can devise a phrase like this one to deal with his own mental game issue. If injecting logic doesn't work, then maybe the emotional threshold is passed. Maybe the statement isn't strong enough. Maybe there's a new mental game issue at cause, or like a different one. Maybe there's more than one issue. That's possible. Accumulated emotion flooded your mind, so maybe it's like it's not possible to recover from that. Or maybe a voice recorded statement is better for you. I know that it's not for me, but I can see that some people could use that. I mean, all kinds of people. Process of injecting logic. So first, you have to recognize the emotional surge. So you have to know that something is happening. Take a deep breath, Inject logic. That's like remind yourself of your sort of mantra that you have ready for the occasion. Then maybe you have like a strategic reminder, like a technical point, like oh, I have to think not to open too widely. Usually when I get mad, I open all the hands, or something like that maybe. And of course, repeat if necessary. And if it doesn't work, then maybe you should quit. Of course, if you can, if you're in like a later stage of a tournament, of course you cannot. You have to battle through it. But if you're playing cash game online, it's pretty easy to quit. Off-table work on mental game issues. So you can use a mental hand history to define the root cause of your mental game issue. So you should write down the problem. So using pen and paper, also write down why it does make sense that you would react in that way. Also describe how that logic is flawed. Like I'm expecting to win like every time I'm having like a 80-20 advantage pre-flop, but of course you're gonna lose some of the time. You can describe to yourself how your expectations are flawed, what's the correct way to handle the situation, like what you should instead think, and how that correction is appropriate. That's redundant, but it's helpful. And the author is very big on writing down things here, so you can like have them right in front of you, and you cannot like put it away, maybe unconsciously. Or so writing down everything, it has to make sense as you write it. You have to like form uh proper ideas that are sound. And so writing down can be quite powerful, I think. And the author seems to know that. He often suggests writing down things, like even the small things. Also talking about tracking improvement. So uh, we can deduce improvement if we see like an increased recognition of our patterns in real time. So you can like more frequently or easily recognize that you're going on tilt. That's improvement. If you can recognize pattern before reaching threshold, like emotional threshold, if you can recognize them before, that's improvement. You don't reach a threshold anymore. Stronger ability to control emotions. If you can witness that, that's good. Make sure you see game mistakes. You can play longer while battling the mental game issue that you have at hand. You can quit faster when needed. Like you, instead of spewing 40 buy-ins on monkey tilt, maybe you can spew just 5. That's good. That's improvement. Able to recover the mindset faster after a session. Uh, so for me, once I started doing a proper, like I will say, a better warm up and evaluation, I could see that my mindset could recover faster. So that's good. That's improvement. Less urge to berate opponents. So, so getting less emotional. You feel faster, normal faster after a session. Your absolute worst is better than before. You can recognize new mental game issues. That's good. Um, and you have an increased desire to work on your game off the table. That's positive. So tilt, it's a result of a conflict between what the player knows consciously and flaws in their mental game at the unconscious competence level. So why do we still tilt even though we know the logic? The mental game skill might not be learned to the unconscious competence level. So maybe some more work has to be done. Accumulated emotions overwhelm mental defenses.
एमजी क्या है
And maybe you
एमजी
think
क्या
you know
होता
your
है
mental game skill, but you don't.
न्यूट्रली है ना
ये
So here we have 7 types of
flaws in
tilt.
their MG
Okay, so the first one is running bad tilt. So you're tilting because you're having such a bad stretch of cards. Injustice tilt, you think you don't deserve something. Hate losing tilt. Self-explanatory. Mistake tilt, you hate making mistakes. Entitlement tilt. That's a classic Phil Hellmuth. Like things like somebody deserves to win because they're better. Revenge tilt and desperation tilt, when you think nothing um, is possible for you anymore, like you're bound to losing or something. So let's take one example. I'm supposed to win against X. I work and study harder than X. How can I be losing? So maybe we don't spew stacks, but maybe some of that phrase could be like resonating within ourselves. So the cause is overconfidence. It is possible to inject logic. So for example, it's not possible to win every hand. So if we think we can win every hand, then we're having dishonest expectations or wrong expectations, and we have to change that, or we will tilt, or at least have a mental game issue. We can look for entitlement tilt when moving up stakes. So you move up stakes, you think, it's the same thing. People are no better. Well, maybe they're a bit better. So analyzing our tilt issue, we should consider our mastered strengths, that is our core knowledge, our bad habits. So outdated core knowledge, that is both in the unconscious competence part of the adult learning model, and then what is being learned, that's the conscious competence part. And we can see some things are going to miss or show up, like mistakes showing up and things we learn missing. So when we evaluate, we'll see that we knew what we should have done, but we didn't do it. Why? Probably a tilt issue. Next, fear. So symptoms, mind goes blank. We feel rushed for no reason playing a hand. We constantly review hands in our mind, constantly check cashier. That's very bad. Or constantly check chip stack size. Maybe it's not so bad as you have, like when you play live, you have to know how many chips you have. But if you like constantly look at it, maybe it's a symptom of something else going on. Like maybe itself, it isn't bad, but that's still a symptom. Then you only play poker when you feel perfect, a symptom of playing under fear. You avoid high variance lines. You're reluctant to move up in stakes, another symptom. Like sometimes you have to have a couple of these, like a disease. Some diseases need many symptoms to be plausible, right? So the causes of fear, you're having high expectations. You think you can control, but you can't. You're failing to see success. Um, Maybe you think you can win every session. That's not possible. Maybe you think success should be coming in easy. That's not possible either. Um, so a few types of fear: fear of success, making mistakes, bad run, moving up stakes. Risk aversion is a type of fear. And some common, not common, but some logic that we can inject, like remind ourselves that striving for permanent perfection is an exercise in constant frustration and disappointment. So maybe that helps if we're the like a type of fearful player. Maybe something like that will help us. Um, Next, motivation. Often a lack of motivation is a symptom of another mental game issue. And some motivation related problems. For example, we're going to play too much or too little during run good or run bad. We're going to procrastinate studying on our game. We don't feel like playing after a setback. We dream of playing in rail heaven. And so somebody maybe would be reluctant to playing lower stakes because they're looking forward, like so far ahead. Or maybe we improve so quickly that our game falls apart when we lose momentum. Again, depending on our expectations, our motivation could be impacted by some things, some situations, some scenarios like this. So a couple more motivation related problems. Only considering monetary results is going to cause problems. Again, we can look at our mental game progress and also how well we played or didn't. That's part of our results, not just the the cash value. Also having high expectations, having no short-term goals, reaching our goals and failing set new ones. These are problems with motivation. Having too many goals, that's too much. Having too many interests, or having underlying goals, such as trying to look good, don't want to be bluff catching when somebody has a hand, so you don't bluff catch enough because you don't want to look bad because that pretty girl over there, whatever. Sources of motivation: winning, need the money, so professional players there. Learning and improving as a player, proving people wrong, feeling challenged by poker. Maybe the love of poker is your motivation. Maybe you have dreams for the future, like you're looking at this your nice $5 million villa. And so some of these are going to be better for your game than others, obviously. If you're motivated by the love of poker, maybe that's better than like you really need to win to pay groceries next week. So the same kind of pressure involved. Um, Laziness and procrastination, they're both learned skills. Maybe if you're prone to that, maybe you should make a list of things to do. Maybe you should write down excuses that you make to yourself. So not just making the to-do list, but if you don't do it, maybe write down why you didn't do it, and so it's in front of you. You can't avoid it. Procrastinators tend to work and study at the last minute, and so they tend to have ups and downs in their play because they're learning too much in too little time. They feel overtaken by players who are more consistent. They have a false impression of how much one can learn because they try to learn too much at the same time. They think it's much bigger than it is really, and they tend to be confused as they have much more to think about when they play because they didn't like have the necessary time for their brains to soak up all that information. So maybe these guys would benefit of reminding themselves of a phrase like, today is the day to improve. And if I wait until tomorrow, I will have twice the work to do. So the common causes for lack of motivation is people are gonna feel destined to lose. They're gonna have maybe some injustice still underlying. Maybe people work on their game maybe they think working on their game feels like a waste of time. So maybe they're hopeless, like they have some desperation tilt. Um, Maybe they question their ability. So maybe an issue with confidence, lower stakes in volume, fear of failure. And if you don't want to go on tilt, maybe you have any kind of tilt. Um, if it feels too easy, as if you're printing money, then that's overconfidence. So here we had like the negative side of it, and then here like some quote unquote positive side, like it's too easy. Or if you want to book a win, maybe you're having some risk aversion issue here. And then the confidence, the most complex of the four main emotions, and it is often an unreliable measure of results and skill because flaws in the mental game distort your view of your game, and it is also an unreliable measure of results and skill because often players will use short-term results to form the foundation of their confidence. But variance has such a big impact that maybe that's a bad strategy for our mental game. And so maybe you've tried these options, build a track record over years to prove that you're good, play high volume to reach long term faster. So change volume, desensitize yourself to results, create an illusion in your mind that you're a solid player. These all look very um, plausible, decent, um, obvious strategies. Um, but it's not exactly that. So having stable confidence, it happens from recognizing variance when it happens, recognizing our skill, and also our opponent's skill. So these three have to be present to have stable confidence. And having stable confidence, it doesn't mean that you have no emotion. It means that the ups and downs of your emotions are going to be smaller and smaller, but you're still going to have emotions. Of course, that's normal. We're humans after all. And um, a few variance induced illusions. So variance has an impact on confidence, but maybe it also induces some illusions, like having an illusion of control because we're running so good, an illusion of permanence, like we're always going to lose or always going to win, illusion of learning. And so quickly about variance. Bad skills at recognizing variance biases your estimate on your edge. And spotting variance. So first, when evaluating the marked hands, when we evaluate in the process model, we gotta mark the hands where we think variance was a factor. That's helpful. Before analyzing a session, estimate how much variance was a factor, and compare your estimate of variance's effect to your estimate of how well you played. Yeah. So that's gonna help us deal with the emotions associated with variance, diffusing them. Then, so lastly, before wrapping up, here are a few wishes, maybe like some common unconscious wishes that maybe we have. For example, do you wish you could win every hand? Do you wish poker would always be like when you run well? Do you wish there was no variance in poker? Now you can prove logically to yourself why you would not want these wishes to come true. And describe the effects that those wishes could have on your mental game if you hold some. And you can devise a strategy to get closer to your wishes in a real way. And of course, if you can get rid of those wishes, it will allow for more stable confidence. So you're not gonna have uh, things that you consciously know that's gonna conflict with unconscious knowledge that you've learned, or wrong expectations about your game. Hence, if those conflicts don't show up, then emotions aren't summoned, and you don't have to work on them. And so if we can summarize here, like the broad lines of the work, mental game issues and A game happen for predictable reasons. So you have like the process model that you can use to improve yourself constantly. It's not just random. We have a part to do in it. Learning and improving every day is the best predictor for long-term success. Of course, mental game issues and concepts are intertwined and thus need off-table work. So some of them can be complicated if you have more than one issue, like more than one mental game issue, uh, like lots of links between all the emotions, causes, and consequences. And so we're gonna need to take some time off the table, of course. Applying the process model when playing ensures that your time is spent efficiently when you work on your game. So this was the end of this summary for the Mental Game of Poker by Jared Tendler. Thank you guys for listening.
Thanks, that was really good. Does anyone else have any questions or comments before I jump in?
Oh, no, I don't. Thanks, Max.
Man, I busted the time real bad.
No, that's fine. All right, so I was just wondering. So what was the biggest thing that you got out of reading this book, you personally?
It was the process model. I mean, the HWM and the adult learning model. like they're very good to know, but the process model for me, it really started first changing my routine, like establishing a few goals, a few technical goals that I want to work on. When you start doing that, it's sort of um, like a machine, like a set of gears. Like if you go in the process, it's going to force you to do some things and some new things. It forces you to learn in a sense. One of the big things for me was setting goals before the session. For example, I'm going to play 1,000 hands, or I don't have so much time, maybe like just 500, and then quit when I'm done playing that like goal that I set myself. After the session, estimating how much variance had an effect was big for me also. Um, yeah, so looking at the hands, and uh, since we don't evaluate when we play, if we do it afterwards and can uh, concentrate better on correctly evaluating our hands, we also, in the process of that, see that we did play correctly, and so that there was just variance there, and that helps a lot in diffusing emotions and keeping them from accumulating. That's very big for me also. Yeah, so I would say that.
Yeah, thanks. That's good. Well, I just want to make a few comments. So some of the things that I've noticed by like teaching a lot of people, just in terms of like tilt and stuff, most people vastly overestimate how good they are and underestimate how good their opponents are. And this is, well, it's a good thing, because then you'll end up having opponents that want to play against you. It's a bad thing for you, and it's something you have to like consciously try and fight back against. The edges that you actually have against most of your opponents are dwarfed by the variance that you're going to be playing against, right? So the results of individual sessions, right, is almost all variance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's really only looking back at it over tens of thousands of hands, you can make clear assessments about how much better or worse you are than the people that you're playing against.
Yeah, so when the author says estimate how much variance has an like how much it had an effect on your results, like I'm sort of questioning in my mind how much he thinks it has an effect when he writes that, because I know that yeah, of course, under tens of thousands of hands, it's not like the results are all about variance. So, but just thinking about it is good. Like thinking about how much it has an effect. If you know how much it has an effect, then that's even better, right?
Yeah, yeah. So if you can sort of hold in the back of your mind that the result of any given session will be almost entirely due to variance, you'll probably be much better off in the long term. And even as you're playing, hands that you lose, flips that you lose, whatever, right? Almost all of that is variance. And so playing it in the correct or slightly better way is really the only thing that you should be aiming for. And then another thing is probably going back to giving your opponent more credit than you are currently, right? Because the difference in skill is not that big, right? At least not compared to the variance. So you might have twice as much experience as your opponent, but that doesn't mean that you're going to win twice as often. right? You're gonna probably only win just a few percent more here and there. Another thing I liked about what was going on in this book is the structure, and so you highlighted that, and you highlighted the benefit that you got from that. I find that adding structure to the way that you play, rather than just hopping on at a whim, or just going to the casino if you're playing live and then just sitting there and grinding for hours and hours, is a lot more the structured way of doing it is a lot more beneficial than an unstructured way of doing it. So, for example, say you're a live player, and so I know you're an online player, and this book might have been a bit more geared towards the online players. I'm not sure, but say, for example, live players, and you're playing for a living, so like full time, right? A full time job is usually between 40 and 50 hours a week. But for some reason, some live players do 60, 70, 80 hours at the table. And then after 6 months or a year, if you go in and dissect the results, you end up finding that the hours that they've played over time are just massively minus EV. They're massively hemorrhaging, right? So the hours that they're playing tired is negative. It's having a negative impact on their win rate.
Yeah.
Right. So then it's a negative E play to be sitting there the extra 2 hours, even though you think the game is good. And the issue is that because you're tired, right? You're mentally tired. You might not be physically tired because you've just been sitting there for a long time. You don't really realize that you're tired, and you might tilt easier, but you don't realize that you're on tilt. Like you said, the ability to recognize that you're tilting gets limited by emotional states and being tired. So one of the biggest recommendations that I can make for people who are playing live and professionally is to cap the amount of time that they're playing each week at roughly that of a full-time job. So probably around 40 hours a week, and be very selective about which hours you're playing, and have plenty of rest and time away from the table while you're doing it. And sort of the same kind of thing can go to online players as well, to a slightly lesser extent. Online players, you can just sit there and grind for 24 hours, right? And like do the whole old school uni student piss in a bottle kind of weird shit, right? If you're trying to actually make money from playing online poker, then you got to limit the amount of hours that you play, because you'll find that the hours that you play tired will be massively minus EV to you. Right? It's just a whole playing the ABC game. When you're tired, the whole curve shifts down towards the C game.
Mm-hmm.
So your C is the new B, right? And you really want to be playing your B game only very rarely. And then you got like a D game, which is just weird monkey tilt shit, which ends up being the majority of your losses. Yeah, so that's all the comments that I wanted to make. Right, I liked that the idea of writing down your thoughts and feelings about each of the situations, and I find that's quite important. It's been proven to work in the domain of psychology and psychiatry, in cognitive behavioral therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, cognitive behavioral therapy is the idea that your thoughts your emotions, and your behaviors all affect each other, right? So if you get into some sort of emotional state, that's going to affect the way that you think, and it's going to affect the way that you behave. But you can sort of counteract that by having, I think the author of this book was injecting logic, having some solid, concrete thoughts about the situation, and then that would affect the way that you behave, and then that behavior changes the way that you feel about the situation.
Mhm.
Right? So instead of having your emotions end up impacting your thoughts and behaviors, you have your thoughts impacting your behavior, and then your behavior impacting your emotion.
Yeah, so
And so you can get on top of things like that.
there's a lot of feedback loops in that kind of subject.
Yeah. And one of the biggest things is that this sort of way of breaking down your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors is very much proven in the science of psychiatry and psychology and psychodynamic psychotherapy. So, yeah, it is something to be mindful of and try and use if you can. And I recommend people do use just writing down the way that you think and the way that you feel, and sort of analyzing those thoughts and feelings. Yeah, I think that's all I had to say. Does anyone else want to ask questions or say anything?
No, I don't have too much to add. I thought it was good, Max, and it's a book that I've long overdue needed to go out and get. So I'm going to put it on my list.
Yeah, it's very much worth it, I think.
All right, great. So I think we'll have a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back, and George, you can present
Okay, yeah, fine.
your topic. All right, so everybody back.
Yep.
Right. So, does anyone have any questions before George starts? Any questions or comments or anything we want to go over? Sorry, your mic's not working so well. You can type, but probably a bit better. Yeah, sorry. The mic, your mic isn't working very well. Yeah, okay. I think he's got a loop there. All right. Very good. Okay. Hello. So we're just about to start George's presentation. Yep, George, whenever you're ready, you can start.
Okay, so I'm assuming my screen is up okay and the volume's okay. You guys can hear me all right?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about out of position play and defending in 3-bet pots. So in terms of the stuff I want to cover, I'm going to look at the ranges that the button would 3-bet and cutoff would be calling at in this situation, and also look at the whole card densities so that we can get an appreciation for which type of flops favor which type of player. I've come up with some different ways that helps me to visualize that process and understand how the ranges interact with the whole cards that the different players would have. And then I've come up with a way to understand the relationship between equity, bet sizing, and betting frequency. And a process I use that helps me quite a bit in visualizing it is using weighted bet sizes. And it makes it really crystal clear for me to see how those three elements are tied together using these weighted bet sizes. And then number 4, I'm going to look at different strategies that the out of position player, the cutoff, would have on both the flop and turn in 4 different situations. So I look at the cutoff's donking strategy, his check calling strategy. So what he does on different turn runouts after check calling, check raising strategy, which I think we all come across quite often when defending out of position. And then what happens when the flop goes check, check. So for purposes of this discussion, I'm going to stop at the turn. I'm not going to take the discussion into the river. The game tree just gets too big, but hopefully, as part of this discussion, it'll create some ideas that would help those that are interested try to maybe move some of these things I discuss into the river. So a couple of notes just to set the expectations here. This presentation, it's not an analysis of what your strategy should be with a given hand in a given spot. It's not meant to do that. Instead, what I'm hoping to get across is to provide a high-level overview of what are the common bet sizes and frequencies across the different board textures and across different runouts. And then given that, I'm going to leave it to the reader to dig a bit deeper to try to understand what this may mean to specific hands and specific spots. And in order to help with that, I'm going to provide some links afterwards to the sim files I used for those of you that want to dig a little bit further to understand better what may be going on underneath what we're seeing at the high level. So let's first set the stage, what we're looking at. So we're looking at a 3-bet pot where you got cutoff versus button. The starting stacks are 100 big blinds effective. The cutoff opens at 2 big blinds, and the button 3-bets to 6 big blinds at cutoff calls. So the starting pot is just over 13 big blinds, and the SPR is just under 7. I've used Zenith ranges for this analysis. And in this case, I ran the sims using a pile solver. And I use a feature that pile solver has called the aggregation report. And this is what I use to generate the spreadsheets and the graphs that I'm going to be covering. So hopefully some of you might be using PySolver. I know many of you are GTO Plus users, but I think the ideas will come across even though I'm using this with PySolver. So what I've shown here are the ranges that I've taken for the button when he 3-bets and a cutoff when he calls. So you can see what the different distributions look like. The button has 234 different combos that he's 3-betting versus a cutoff open. And the cutoff is calling with a fairly tighter, more condensed range of 127 combos. So this was pulled right out of the Zenith charts. Now, of course, how one interprets the Zenith charts is a matter of personal preference. And what I wanted to show here was that for purposes of this analysis, I wanted to show how I interpreted the Zenith color charts. I don't think there's a right or wrong way of doing it. I've seen, different people talk about different frequencies, but I wanted to show that, the results that I'm going to discuss are based on these frequencies. So, for example, always, of course, means 100%. When we're saying that something is often done this and otherwise done that, I interpret that as 67% often being the weighting and 33% for the otherwise, and so on. One or the other, like call or fold, I give that a 50-50 weighting, and then the blue one, which is raise, call or fold, I give that 33% for each of them. So that's basically how I assign the weightings to the different ranges. So having done this, what I've done was I created an Excel spreadsheet, and then from that created a chart where I looked at the different ranges, the cutoff and button ranges. And I had a look and said, okay, well, what are the density of the different types of cards that they would have in their range? So, for example, if you want to look at any given ace, how many aces out of all the different cards that are in the range, what percentage of them would contain an ace for the button? And you can see that, like, just under 40% of the total number of cards would contain an ace. And I did it so on for the different cards from king down to deuce. And what's useful about this is it helps to get an idea as to what kind of flops would favor what type of player. So you can see, for example, flops that have a high proportion of 10 and higher type rank cards, that tends to favor the buttons range. And then ranks 9 and lower, the low connected type flops would favor the cutoff. I think through many of our plays we appreciate that, but it's always useful to put it up in a graph form to actually see how the different flop types would interact with the different players' ranges. So what I did was I looked at 17 flops in total for this study, and 15 of the flops I took from a subset that are supposed to represent the total unique flops that are available, in the game of poker. And I pulled these flops out of the GTO Plus link that I've included here. So what the GTO Plus guys did was they ran different subset of flops ranging from 15 flops up to 163 that are supposed to represent the entire game. I did 15 just to keep things at a workable level, and I think it's enough to convey some of the ideas I want to get across. Here are the flops and the type of flops. So you got connected high, connected low, there's monotone, and then you get the different type paired, the span flops, etc. I also, in discussing with my mentor, added 2 additional flops. So I got 17 in total for purposes of this, of what I'm covering here. The other important thing to appreciate is, the different bet sizings that are used as part of the simulations that I ran on PySolver. So I've got the cutoff bet sizes for flop, turn, and river, and also the button bet sizes for flop, turn, and river. I chose to have quite a few flops available in terms of the betting. I think it's useful to do that because obviously you need to know when you need to bet small or bet large or overbet. I've got some check raises, different check raising sizes in here, 3-bet sizes in terms of the cutoff. So you can see I've got quite a good selection of bet sizes here that should give a pretty decent appreciation of what the different strategies should be for cutoff and button in a 3-bet pot. Now, something new that I started to work with is what I call the weighted bet size. And what I mean by a weighted bet size at a particular node, this is done by calculating, by multiplying each bet size by its frequency, summing the result, and dividing by the total betting frequency. So, for example, let's take a node where, at that point, the cutoff is checking 25%. He's betting a quarter pot 60% of the time. He's betting half pot 10% of the time, and pot a full 5% of the time. So in order to calculate the weighted bet size, you do this calculation where you multiply the size by the frequency and then divide it by the total betting frequency. And this kind of gives you a representative bet size for that particular spot. And what I found is that by studying the weighted bet size, we can really quickly see the relationship between equity, bet sizing, and frequency. So what I'm going to do now is run through a few different graphs. Well, first of all, the process that I used. So to begin with, I use PileSolver, and I've run all the sims, and then I run this report called the flop aggregation report. And what that will do is it will take all 17 flops and we'll look at different runouts and dump the results into a Excel spreadsheet. So once it's dumped into an Excel spreadsheet, I can organize and look at the different flops. I can look at the equities. I can look at the bet sizes that the player whose action it's on is taking, and the frequencies. And then I added a column here, which I call the weighted bet size, where I do that calculation that I talked about, where I take all the different bet sizes and frequencies and come up with a weighted version of it. And then I'll go ahead and use the Excel graphing feature to to present different graphs to help understand what's going on in terms of the strategies. So that's the process that I followed for these different spots. So the first graph I'm showing here is the cutoff donking frequency, his donking strategy on the flop. So he's first to act. And what you can see here with the orange line is the betting frequency. And on the horizontal axis are the 17 different flops. So I'm not sure how clearly it shows, but you can see that we've got like 9, 8, 7 flops all the way to the ace, 10, 5. So we've got the 17 different flops. The blue line is the equity that the cutoff has. And then this gray line is that weighted bet size. So that's the cutoff donking strategy. And by looking at this, a couple of things become readily apparent. First of all, you can see that bet size and frequency are inversely related. And I think we all, many of us, had this knowledge, had this, understanding in terms of strategies. However, it's interesting to see it in a graph form. The other thing you can notice is that flops with rank 10 and smaller are donked more often and for a smaller size. So if you look at this area here where you got flops that have like the highest card is a 9, an 8, a 10, and smaller, you can see that typically these are bet a bit more frequently and at a smaller size. And on the other hand, the higher ranked flops are donked less often and are done for a larger size. So that's a relationship you can see in a donking strategy in this particular spot. So what I've highlighted here in yellow are two flops that I've chosen to look at a bit more detail, so we can see actually what the turn strategy would be. So once again, having run the flop aggregation report and generating the graph, we can look at the turn strategy after a quarter pot donk on the flop for this particular flop, the 9-8-7, 9 of diamonds, 8 of clubs, 7 of hearts. And the first thing that's readily apparent is that once again, you've got this inverse relationship between betting frequency and the bet size that's used, the weighted bet size that's used. So that still holds true. In addition, what you can see is that, what rank cards tend to be bet frequently and at a small size. You can see, for example, 5 and 6 turn cards tend to be bet often and at a smaller bet size. And then at the other end of the scale, you can see these higher Broadway cards that come on the turn. They're bet a little bit less frequently and at a higher bet size. And this would make sense because these cards tend to interact well with the button's 3-betting range. So he would have called it. He would have floated the quarter pot donk, and these cards are very good for the range. So this is a good opportunity for the cutoff to get polar with his bet sizing and frequency. Whereas these cards here, the 5s, the 6s, and 4s are good for the cutoff's range. And he would tend to bet them more often and at a smaller size. And then I've highlighted 2 other sets of turn cards, the Jack and the 10. And what you see here is that these tend to be bet at a smaller size on average and at a lower frequency. And the reason being is that these cards interact quite well with draws that are in both players' ranges. And usually what happens, what I've seen in these types of spots is that when you have a draw completing card, you tend to bet a little bit less frequently and a little bit smaller than you would otherwise. So I just wanted to highlight that. And once again, the whole idea is to look at the sims and try to understand, what hands would actually, want to bet like this, when a Jack or a 10 comes on the turn. So if we look at the 7 of club, 6 of diamonds, 6 of club, flop and the turn strategy after the quarter pot donk that the cutoff makes. Once again, it's an inverse relationship between bet frequency and bet size. You can see the cards that are bet frequently and at a small size. So basically, it's the lower ranked cards and the ones that are basically not interacting too much with this particular flop. And then the ones that are bet less frequently at a higher size are the ones that are the aces and kings and queens that are essentially good for the buttons range. So this is very similar to the previous flop, that you want to get more polar when the turn card is good for the 3 betters range, the initial 3 betters range. So the second scenario we're going to look at is a donking strategy. Once the button has actually c-bet, what does a donking strategy look like on the turn? So I've looked at, once again, the different flops, the 17 different flops, and looked at all possible turn cards. The aggregation report looks at all possible turn cards and accumulates what is the betting frequency. And I've calculated here the weighted bet sizes based on all possible turn cards. And you can see, again, it's an inverse relationship between frequency and bet size. And you can also see that the types of flops that tend to be donked after a flop c-bet by the button tend to be the lower ranked flops, which is what you would expect because they have a donking frequency on the flop to begin with. So why not donk on certain turn cards after a c-bet. And the ones that are not donked very often on the turn tend to be the higher ranked flops with higher ranked cards in it, which is what you would expect to see. So we're going to look at the these two that I've highlighted in yellow in a bit more detail to see actually what kind of turn cards are donked. So yeah, it's a similar strategy. So let's take the 9 of diamonds, 4 of hearts, 3 of clubs, the turn donking strategy after the flop c-bet. And again, it's the inverse relationship, continues to hold true between betting frequency and bet size. I've grouped here these particular cards on the turn, which are bet frequently and at a smaller size, so roughly about 30% size of pot here. And the reason you would probably see these cards is that you know they're obviously very good for the cutoffs range, so he'll want to bet them often and at a smaller size. And then similarly, you can see the kind of cards that are more favorable for the buttons range, and as a result, the cutoff is going to want to get more polar with these type of cards, turn cards, when they come. And then if we look at the 10 of diamonds, 9 of clubs, 6 of clubs, and how the different cards interact, what I've highlighted here are, I'm looking here at diamond turn cards, which bring a backdoor flush draw, and different types of diamond turn cards. And you can see that, for example, the ace of diamonds, bringing the backdoor diamond flush draw, is bet at a, you know, he's bet, the bet size is what, nearly 1.4 pot. So it's a very polar bet sizing. And one of the reasons that, you know, you can look more at depth in the sims, but one of the things that I've seen about this is that, you know, that ace of diamonds is a good card for the button. It makes it very unlikely that he's floating the, it makes it very unlikely that, you know, he has a diamond flush draw. It makes it more likely he has a club draw, for example, or that he has an ace. So it's the kind of card that the cutoff can get very polar with. Whereas king of diamonds, queen of diamonds, these cards interact with draws with a 10 of diamond, 9 of clubs, so they interact with straight draws, and as a result, may not want to get bet as frequently. So you can kind of see relationships here, and then you can, once again, you can look at the sims to see what the exact relationships are to try to understand how these frequencies occur and how these bet sizings occur. So the third scenario to look at is check raising. So the cutoff checks, the button bets, and the cutoff does a check raise. So what does the strategy look like for the different flops? You know, what kind of flops are check raised often, and what kind of flops are not check raised very often? So you know, 9 of diamonds, 8 of clubs, 7 of hearts are check raised often. You can see the size, and you can see there's somewhat of a relationship, inverse relationship between bet size and frequency. Maybe not as strong a relationship as we saw in the earlier scenarios, but nonetheless, there appears to be that kind of relationship. So the cutoff turn strategy, once the check raise has occurred and a turn card comes, what's the cutoff strategy after that turn card? And what's the strategy on average across all possible turn cards? Yeah, interesting to note is that for all the different initial flops under consideration, that the bet sizing is roughly hovering around 50% across all different types of turn cards. And I was a bit surprised to see that at first, and I was thinking, well, why aren't we seeing you know, more of like an inverse relationship like we were seeing with the other strategies? And I guess what I concluded was that it has to do with the fact that the SPR, that there was a check raise, the SPR has come down quite a bit. And the cutoff strategy is to try to have two streets, try to play the turn and the river to get the money in on the river. That's my suspicion, and I think looking a bit more in detail at the sims would bring that out. So I've selected two flops here: ace of spades, seven of spades, two of diamonds, eight of hearts, five of diamonds, three of diamonds, to look at a bit deeper to see what the turn strategy is after check raising the flop. So what we can see here is that with the eight of spades, seven of spades, two of diamonds, that the bet sizing that's used across all possible turn cards, on average, the weighted bet size tends to be around 50%, which is what we saw on the previous slide. And the frequency, which is in orange, we have a decreasing frequency here. But what I highlighted here are the flush completing cards. So these are all the spade turn cards that completes the flush. And these tend to be bet a bit more often. So I think, in looking at the sim, what you'll see then is that the cutoff is going to be check raising on the flop a good number of his flush draws, and will continue betting for value when the flush completes on the turn. And then his bluffs, of course, would be the Broadway cards that have the flush blocker to it. So I think we probably bear that out in the sims if you look a bit more in depth. But this just kind of gives an overall view of what the strategies look like. And then you can see there's different types of turn cards that aren't bet as often, such as the ace of diamonds, ace of hearts. I'm sorry, ace of diamonds, ace of hearts, ace of clubs. Those aren't bet very often. So this graph shows the turn strategy after check raising the flop for the ace of hearts, five of diamonds, three of diamonds. And what I've highlighted here are these peaks. And these tend to be the backdoor draws that come in. So basically what it's calling for here is a more polar bet sizing as the backdoor flush card comes in. So that's an interesting, I think it's something that many of us would expect to see, but nonetheless, it's interesting to see this in a graph form. And then it also, it spurs us to look a bit more deeper into the actual sims to try to understand, okay, well, what cards are we betting for value when the seven of hearts come, and which ones are we bluffing with, and what does that mean in terms of the overall strategy? And then the final strategy is the one which is a turn probe strategy after the button checks back the flop. So basically the flop goes check, check. And looking at the strategy for all the flops across all possible turn cards, the inverse relationship between bet size and frequency comes into view here, which makes sense. There's going to be a need to, depending on the turn card, the cutoff is going to want to get a bit more polar and is going to want to try to set the stage for getting the money in by the river. So he's going to need to have the ability to bet large, or depending on the turn card, depending on the flop, you might not bet as large. So in this case, I picked two flops, the nine of diamonds, four of hearts, three of clubs, the eight of hearts, five of diamonds, three of diamonds, to understand what the turn probe strategy looks like after the flop goes check, check. So for the nine of diamonds, four of hearts, three of clubs, I mean, you've got an excellent representation here of the inverse relationship between bet frequency and bet size. You can see the cards that are bet frequently and at a smaller size, like between 40 and 50% of pot. And these are cards that tend to be low and ranked. So basically, eight high and less turn cards. And then once again, as you would expect, turn cards that are very good for the buttons range. So he's going to be checking back, the button's going to be checking back a lot of his ace X type hands with showdown value. So when these and King X hand, so when these cards pair up, you're going to find that the cutoff is going to have a polar betting strategy. When he bets, he's going to bet less frequently and at a larger size. Let's look at another flop. 8 of hearts, 5 of diamonds, 3 of diamonds. Once again, you see the inverse relationship between bet size and frequency. And I've picked a couple of different turn cards to show how they relate. So I basically have picked a flush completing turn card, ace of diamonds, king of diamonds, and also similar ace and kings that bring in the backdoor flush draw. So when the backdoor flush draw comes in, it's an opportunity to bet more polar. And when the flush completing card comes in, can still bet at a fairly large size, but maybe not necessarily as large because both the cutoff and button have flushes in their range. So this is a card that actually changes hand values for both the cutoff and the button. So that was the graphs I wanted to share. Hopefully they were of interest. And as a summary, one of the takeaways is that analyzing the whole card densities, as I showed earlier in the presentation, it makes it much easier to understand how ranges interact with different flop textures. The flop aggregation report, combined with the weighted bet sizing calculation and putting this in graphical form, it's a very useful way for understanding the relationship between equity, bet sizing, and frequency in different spots. And often what you'll see is that the bet sizing and frequency are inversely related. And one way to use this approach is that it gives a springboard for analyzing solver solutions in greater depth. So when you can start seeing the relationships between bet sizing, equity, frequency, turn runouts, it can prompt one to say, okay, well, let me look at this particular solver solution in more depth and try to understand why that relationship is there, and which hands and which turn cards are used to bet at these different sizes. And then finally, knowing which flops to dunk or check raise, along with the bet sizing and frequency, this will ensure that you have a very strong cutoff defense strategy in 3-bet pots. Okay, so that's what I wanted to cover. Is there any questions?
I think WBS is a nice find.
Yeah, that is an interesting use of the weighted bet size there. Can I make one comment about that? Because we know bet sizing isn't like very linear. It's probably better to use your weightings and go through alpha. So you convert all the sizes into alpha and then weight the alpha, and then once you've got the weighted alpha, you can invert that back into the corresponding size. So you do your linear weights in alpha rather than in the bet size. It probably won't change very much about the talk. We just technical point in terms of the mathematics.
So that's, could you run that again, Thomas, just to make sure I understand what your comment is there?
Yes, let me I'll just share my screen. So you got you've got a bunch of bet sizes in S, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what you are doing so far is just basically creating your S bar as the 1 over n, the sum of your S, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. SI. but we know that the bet sizes aren't linear, so you can't really sum these up. The only thing that is linear is alpha, right? So then what you should do, what you can do is you can create this alpha I.
Oh,
right?
there's some of each
So,
individual alpha. I get it.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
this doesn't work very well because the bet sizes themselves aren't. They're not linear, right? Because of how alpha works. The alphas are linear, right? The alphas are a linear representation of all possible bet sizes, right? So like if I added a number, like say I want to bet 10% of the pot, right? And then I want to bet like 1,000% of the pot, right? If I want to weight these two together, right, the average is like 505%, right? The weighted average.
Oh, I'm with you because alpha is going to be much more linear. It's going to range between
yeah.
yeah,
So
boundaries are going to be much more sensible. Yeah.
Yeah. So say you got an alpha of 0.1 and then like 0.9, then the average is 0.5, right? And then that's a bet size of, and you can convert it, right? So then
convert that back to a weighted bet size. I'm with you.
yeah. And then this is just 1, right? Which is 100% of the pot.
Right.
Which makes more sense, right? What's in between a tenth of a pot and 10 times a pot? No, it's 1 pot, right?
Yeah. I can see
so
that.
It'd be better to do it.
Now, I guess that comes more into play
way.
when you're factoring in overbets and 200, 400% of the pot, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't think it changes any of the key principles of your presentation. It's just a slightly slightly more precise way of weighting the bet sizes. Use alpha instead. Yeah, great. Great talk. Good overview of what's going on. The relationship between the average bet size and the betting frequency is usually in an inverse, and that's true in almost all situations. Looking and going through the different flops, the different flop textures, and analyzing them for donking is pretty important because most people don't donk. So donking can be a good addition to your strategy, and it has become pretty important when you get into situations where your range is actually tighter than your opponent's and you're out of position. So in the cutoff versus button example, which you showed, button had about like 200 combos and cutoff only had 100.
Half that number, yeah.
Yeah, roughly half that, right? So the cutoff range is actually tighter than the buttons, but the flip side of that is that the cutoff is capped in the sense that they don't have the very strong overpairs. So if it weren't for those overpairs and those big ace x king x hands, you would expect the cutoff to be betting at a very high frequency on almost all flops, but because of those the overpairs and the strong pre-flop unpaired hands, certain flops just become way better for the cutoff. Those Broadway cards hit the buttons range a lot stronger than the cutoffs range, and so then the donking frequency should drop. It's less pronounced in like button versus big blind single raise pot, because when you open the 2 big blinds, your range is actually tighter than the big blinds. Like you open 40% and they defend like 50-60% of hands. So then there's a lot less donking. But in situations where the opposition player has a tighter range pre-flop, there will be more donking, and you just have to figure out how to deal with that. And the donking size is usually quite small. Another note with the thing that with your presentation is that like mathematically, like when you have a donking frequency that's like 0.5% or 0.1%, something like that,
Could be rounding error.
and then like a big bet size, yeah, it could just be a slight error just in your sim, either because it's not accurate enough.
I ran them to 0.5%. Yeah, I was aware of that, and I think the whole idea was to just kind of give a sort of a general view, and hopefully
and you definitely did, but yeah, knowing what flops and turns to donk and what flops and turns not to donk is probably the first step. And then after that, after you know, okay, well, these sort of flops, I want to have a donking range, then you can think about what the donking range might be. And then you can use some of the techniques that you looked at and looked at the average bet sizing. And then you can see, okay, well, the average bet sizing is actually pretty small, and that allows me to bet more frequently and be a little bit less polar. So then your donking range ends up being a little bit less polar, and then you have to then study how to deal with the raise to your donk, because some players are going to raise you quite poorly, and then you're going to have to 3-bet. So it's just
especially if you're donking, to a small size like a quarter pot.
Yeah, some players are just going to go nuts with that against you. Yeah, it's an extra layer to study, and it is quite important because if you know the donking strategies a lot better than your opponent, then you can actually donk quite at a high frequency when the board favors you, and so you can push that small edge a lot more than would be just in GTO, right? If you know exactly how to play this donk line and your opponent doesn't, then your opponent's going to make mistakes in that donk line, and so you can capitalize on those mistakes by taking that line more frequently. So it always is when you're moving higher up about studying and studying the game tree as a whole, and using what you know and your assessment about what your opponent knows, and combine those two together to create good exploits. Right? So your opponent might actually decide that on the bad flops, when you check, they're going to be checking back a whole lot more than what is in GTO, right? And using the sort of 50% rule. So the way to exploit your opponent who is checking back a lot of hands is to sort of prevent them from checking back when you have a strong hand by leading it at a high frequency. So then your checking range can be left actually quite weak, because you get to see the turn more often than you should, and then you can just have those stronger hands in your donking range.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the exploits that you can use against a player that will check back these scary flops too often. Right, scary for their range.
Right.
Yeah, a good overview. Good analysis of the different lines and the different bet sizes used. And you're right about the SBR. Once the SBR gets low, the sizes become a lot more closer to geometric. Just because there's not as much room to move around. Also, if your sim doesn't have like very close bet sizes, you might not be able to pick up as much, right? So like, say the sim only has options to choose between 50 and 100%. If you added a 75%, you might end up shifting it a bit more towards 75% instead.
Mhm.
Yeah, and so I'm in the smaller versus button 3-bet pot sims using quite a few bet sizes to figure out what's what. And I'll eventually get around to running big sims on button versus cutoff and smaller versus cutoff and all that stuff as well. So yeah, don't worry, just got to hold tight. But yeah, great presentation, George.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions? Anything you want to talk about?
I'm good.
All right. So yeah, thanks for this presentation, guys. They were both very insightful. And for anyone who's watching at home, thanks for listening in. And if you have any questions, you can always ask in the tutorial and teaching chat. All right, I'm going to turn off the recording now.